You might open up your Bibles to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 24, and we'll be looking there in just a moment. It's good to see each one here this evening. We're going to be tonight, we're looking again at one proverb, and we have done this a few times, looking at proverbs that maybe are a little bit more obscure, and particularly as we look at some of those proverbs, we find them, I think, often to be obscure because of cultural changes, cultural distance. We don't live in agrarian times, especially. But we find that the wisdom is still, I think, most effective. And so that's what we're going to be doing this evening, is looking at Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 27, which says in the LSB, "Establish your work outside. Make it ready for yourself in the field, and afterwards you shall build your house." So this is, again, definitely agricultural, right? You're working in the field versus building a house, and it's comparing those two aspects of the work to be done. And I just want to spend some time this evening thinking about what that proverb means in its place and setting, and then how it can apply for us today. Well, as we're looking at the proverb, there is a comparison to make, and it is the work in the field versus the work of building a house. And I think the idea is the idea of produce versus consumption. And I think my points aren't pulling up there. Oh, well. All right. Make your PowerPoint before you present. But you just pull that down, Kevin. We won't worry about that. So as we're thinking about that, in Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 27, as I said, establish your work in the field. I think in Proverbs 12 and verse 11, it says, "He who cultivates his land will be satisfied with bread, but he who pursues empty things lacks a heart of wisdom." The idea of the field there, the one who cultivates the land, that's the thing that gives you something, right? So that's the thing that brings a paycheck in our modern terms. But in that case, it's, we talk about bringing home the bacon. This is actually bringing in the food, right? This is very direct correlation. So when you work in the field, when you improve the field, then what you are doing is you are establishing a way to feed yourself and your family. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 11, it says, "Beware lest you forget Yahweh your God by not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today, lest you eat and are satisfied and build good houses and live in them. And your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, and your heart becomes lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." You see, there's a much different idea. In the first place, the establishment, the building up of the field is looked at as something that is wholesome and good. Here, you see the negative connotations that go along with building a house. Not that building a house is wrong, not that that's a problem, but as you're comparing, one is the hard work up front, the other is enjoying the fruit of that labor. And that's what's being described here. You're going to come in and enjoy the fruit of having taken over Canaan, whether it's the work that's already been done in the field, or you're going to build good houses, you're going to live in them, and that indicates prosperity. It indicates enjoying the thing that has been produced. So that's the idea of comparison here. It's not about one of these things is good and one of these things is bad. It's about one of these things needs to come before the other. And that's what we're going to be looking at throughout the lesson. I also want to note that as you look at a proverb like this, it is indicative of something that's true of all of the proverbs, which is that they are generally aimed at the young man. They are aimed at the man who is starting out. So the idea is that you're coming into a field that is a blank slate. You haven't got anything yet. You haven't plowed the fields up. You haven't planted anything. There's no house built. What do you do first? Get the plow out, right? That's the first thing. Don't build the house first. Set the field in order first. In Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 4, it says that these things are written to give prudence to the simple and to the youth knowledge and discretion. Again, down in verse 8, Solomon says, "Hear, my son, your father's discipline, and do not abandon your mother's instruction, for they are a garland of grace for your head and ornaments about your neck." This is advice, this is wisdom, all of this, the Proverbs, are advice and wisdom given to the young man as he is starting out in life. One of the things that I think people complain about as we're thinking about the wisdom of Proverbs is, well, that would have been great information to have known 20 years ago. Well, that's right. And that's always going to be true. I remember, taking Nathan to Dave Ramsey when he was in his teenage years. He was still in high school, and we're sitting there, and Nathan said, "Well, if this math works out like he's talking about, why don't more people do this?" Well, because most people are hearing it after they already haven't done this. And then it's a lot of work to get back to that place where they could go and start over. And there are a lot of people saying, "I wish I had known this all the way back then." So that's true. But even though there are a lot of people who are already down the road and haven't followed this kind of advice, there are two things about that. First of all, it's still wise to tell the next generation. Even if one generation is messed up, it's wise to say to the next generation, don't make the same mistakes. And then secondly, there's still a lot that can be done even if we've already messed up, right? As we open up the Proverbs and we say, I see where I went wrong. It's a helpful thought process to go back to the beginning and think, what would it have looked like if I had started here? And what does that look like starting now where I'm at? So if someone has built the house first, as it were, there is still time in many cases for correction and for getting about the business of setting the field in order. This proverb then is about planning and priority. It's about figuring out what order to do things and making choices, not about good and evil, but about what is best at this moment. In Proverbs 21 in verse 5, it says, "The thoughts of the diligent lead surely to profit, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty." So as you're thinking through, there's a romance about just go out there and do whatever comes to your mind first. No, Proverbs would say, slow down, be thoughtful, be careful about what comes next, and don't be too hasty in a way that leads to ruin. Luke chapter 14, Jesus says in Luke 14 and verse 28, "For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Lest when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish it.'" Now, I know Jesus is making spiritual application, and we will do much the same thing, but he is using the principle of this very proverb, that if you don't set the produce or the productive element in place first, then you will find that you quickly run out of produce in order to enjoy it, as this man did when he didn't calculate. One of the things that I think the Proverbs constantly calls us to acknowledge is the reality of the finite world that we live in. Because I think most people have a mindset of always, why not both? Why not do all the things? Why not take care of the field and build your house? Well, because we are finite people with finite resources, and we can't do all the things at once. And we do have to make choices. We have to make trade-offs. Sometimes there may be occasions where we can work on multiple things at the same time, but much more often we need to make choices about what to sacrifice and what to put off until later. And what frequently happens when we don't make that choice actively, we end up making it passively. Right? So we say we're going to do all of the things, but in reality, what happens is the things that grab our attention less end up by the wayside. And we don't give attention to the things that require more discipline and so forth. So we find that our limits catch up with us in ways that are unpleasant. So how do we begin to apply this proverb then? There are two areas I want to talk about that I think this proverb offers us some application. And the first is that we need to think about creating stability. In our lives, we need stable foundations. There is the practical consideration of actual tangible ways in which we need to have stability, physical ways that we need stability. Between production and consumption. In Proverbs chapter 20 and in verse 4, Proverbs 20 and verse 4, it says, "The sluggard does not plow from winter on, so he begs during the harvest and has nothing." A man who does not establish himself finds that the winter comes on with sudden regularity. It is, I mentioned Dave Ramsey earlier, and I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Dave Ramsey in the last several years, but one of the things that I think is funny to me is when people call in and they talk about something that has come up, and it's an emergency, and they just didn't expect it, and it's almost always things that happen all the time. You know, like a holiday or something. You know, Christmas snuck up on us this year. And he goes, "What do you mean? Like, it was hiding on your calendar?" But people will talk about that, like, you know, normal, like winter. Boy, winter just came out of nowhere. No, it came at the same time it always comes. And you weren't working at this time in order to prepare for that very normal, same year in and year out thing. And because you didn't establish that, because you didn't establish ways of providing for those moments, then of course it's not there. We live, I think, in a time of particular precarious consumption with increasingly unstable levels of production. There are times in our culture, at least in certain pockets of our culture, where people fretted more about the means of production than they did about consuming. They thought more about on that end. We talk about people who come out of the Depression era, and they hate spending money, and they hate using up things, and they save all the things, and maybe we think, oh, well, they went a little bit far in all of that. Maybe. But I think the other extreme is where we're at now, and I think it's far more destructive than the notion that was overly cautious about the consumption and maybe overly focused on the work ethic side. In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 4, it says, "The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the soul of the diligent is enriched." This is just a classic truism. This is the sort of thing that often gets mocked, that hard work is the foundation, that people who are diligent and do the right thing will get ahead and so forth. And people will come in with sort of an Ecclesiastes pushback and say, well, it doesn't always work out though. I know, but Proverbs is saying it generally does. That if you work hard, you will have, and if you don't, you will not have. I think because we live in a particularly prosperous time, or at least have been living in a particularly prosperous time, it has fooled a lot of people into thinking that the Proverbs aren't true in the real world. I remember a few years ago, we were at a holiday event with some extended family who are not Christians, and they were talking about finances. And I remember one family member said something about sort of leveraging debt, and he's into finances, and it was, kind of a scheme. And this other older family member says, well, I'll just tell you, I think that if you work hard and spend less than you make and put away all the while, that's a much more stable position to go. And I thought, well, that sounds real familiar. Now, neither one of them were quoting the scriptures. But one of them basically, incidentally, the one who claims to be a Christian, was saying essentially, that's good folksy wisdom, but it doesn't work in our day and time. And he said that. And I think that people think that about the scriptures, but the scriptures are truth. And truth can be ignored, proverbial truth can be ignored or neglected for only so long before it comes back to bite us in a tidal wave. We need to realize that there is in our culture a building of the appetite for consumption and a depressing of the appetite for production. In Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 17, Proverbs deals with that sort of desire for things. He who loves pleasure, it says, will become a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not become rich. There's a cultivation for the appreciation of the finer things in life. Now, I don't say that those finer things aren't actually finer, that they aren't sweeter and more precious and all of those things, but they are only in material terms. And the destruction comes from the person who longs for that, but doesn't long for the work that brings that. I think on the one hand, you have people in our culture who think that you can just keep going, and you can or view it from the standpoint of consume. And, you know, if worse comes to worse, well, we can always go bankrupt. And that's just a low character position to be in, that says I will put the responsibility for my consumption onto other people. This passage, this proverb, and all through the Proverbs, are trying to convince us that even though the world, yes, does create have some inherent instability, that there is a way, there's a pattern of living that can at least reduce that instability, that can make it a safer and more stable place for ourselves and our family to live. Our society teaches you in a million different ways to focus only on the comfort aspect, on the consumption aspect, and hardly at all on the production aspect. I think about this from the standpoint of ads. The other day I saw a news story that said that, have you seen the refrigerators with the screens on the front? That Samsung had just started pushing ads onto your refrigerator door. And I thought, you can't even walk through your kitchen now, if you have one of these, without seeing ads that says, you need more stuff, you need more stuff. Proverbs is saying you need to be thinking in the opposite direction. You need to be thinking first about how you're going to pay for all of this stuff, how you're going to feed yourself and your family. Well, that's at the beginning stages. Put your effort into the means of production, and then enjoy the comfort that comes from that. But this also continues to be true even after you've built the house. And in fact, I think often this is the more difficult time. Once the house is built, maybe you've even established the field, you've got your income in place, you're able to pay for that house. But then you hit a plateau and maybe become lazy about that. This often happens. Proverbs talks about this in Proverbs 27 and verse 23. Know well the condition of your flocks and pay attention to your herds, for wealth is not forever. Neither is a crown from generation to generation. When the grass disappears and the vegetation appears and the herbs of the mountain are gathered in, the lambs will be for your clothing, the goats will bring a price of the field, and there will be enough goat's milk for your food, for the food of your household, and sustenance for your maidens. So this is somebody that's already got everything in place, but he says keep paying attention, because if you don't, then all the stuff that's supposed to feed you and clothe you when it comes time, it won't be there. And so we establish patterns that bring prosperity, but we don't maintain them perhaps. We reach plateaus and we believe we can coast on the work that was done at the beginning. I think people think about this, think this about life in general. They think they're going to reach some point where life doesn't require diligence anymore. But life always requires diligence. And not only does it always require diligence, but the more diligent you are, the more responsibilities you are likely to take on. That is one of the maybe less thought of aspects of Matthew 25. In Matthew 25 and verse 28, in the parable of the talents, where the one talent man has the talent taken away from him, it says, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. So, yes, he's given another talent. To do what with? Well, presumably repeat the process. Right now, as we talk about this, we talk about, well, you're a one talent man. You weren't expected to be a 5 talent man. You're supposed to get, well, now he's an 11 talent man. And what's he expected to do? The same thing he did with the 5 talents, only at an increased rate, because now he's an 11 talent man. And so the idea is not that we work hard so that at some point we don't have to work hard. It's that we work hard so that we are able to gain more ability to expand our influence and our capacity to be men who sit at the gates and again expand that influence and wisdom and so forth. But the idea is not so that we can retire from life. These, of course, are not merely economic truths. And as I referenced earlier, Jesus takes this principle and applies it in a spiritual way. There's so many ways in which this applies to spiritual aspects of our lives. In Deuteronomy 24 and in verse 5, it speaks of a soldier who has taken a wife. It says, when a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army, nor be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, and shall give gladness to his wife whom he has taken. There's a lot of severe language about the man who stays home while his brothers go to war. And yet, God says to the soldier who's taken on a wife, this is a valid exception. That he ought to stay home and cultivate. He ought to be recognizing that this is the most important thing on my table right now, is establishing this home. I think about that from the standpoint of how we sort of talk to people about starting their lives out, starting their careers out, starting their families out, that the home is more important than any other aspect of what you're doing. And so to establish that. In Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 18, though, it's not just at the beginning, but again, as we were saying, that you must continue. It says there, let your fountain be blessed and be glad in the wife of your youth. This is somebody who's already been married, but he is warning against the possibility that his eyes might begin to stray. You go home and you find joy there in the wife. You reestablish, you continue to build up your marriage. You continue to make it the priority, even after marriage has been established long into the marriage. I think one of the disturbing trends that has cropped up in the last several years is divorces in decades-long marriages. It's a shocking statistic to me. Used to, divorces, the vast majority of divorces happened within the first few years of marriage. The majority still does, but the number of divorces late in life has skyrocketed. And often they happen after the children are outside the home. Because the attention shifted away from this marriage and maybe to the children or other things. And then as they get on in life, they realize, like, we have nothing here. It was all focused elsewhere. And the other things it was focused on are gone. And so they divorce. So priority when the marriage begins, priority as the marriage continues. In Luke chapter 24, I think this is also true of our relationship with God. It says in Luke 24 and verse 28, beginning, they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he were going further, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now nearly over." And so he went to stay with them. And it says, let's see here. This is not the passage I was looking for. Look over at Galatians 6:9. We'll look there in just a moment. What I was pointing to in that passage is the idea of commitment when Jesus calls us. I know it's Luke 14. That he calls us away from our worldly devotions. And he calls us to great acts of devotion. And so when we become a Christian, very often we're having to set aside lots of other entanglements. We're having to put him first, and everything changes. And so we understand the initial investment. But then what? What after we've been a Christian for 30 years? What after we've been a Christian for all of our lives? Well, then we need Galatians 6:9 that says, "Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary." The idea that so many people have of becoming a Christian is just get in the door. Just get the house built and then enjoy the fruits of that initial investment, that initial zeal. But it will not see you through. God is constantly calling people back to the zeal that they first had. So I think there's a number of different ways that we can apply that idea of we need to not only create a stable place in order to enjoy the benefits of that, but that we must go on continuing to focus on maintaining that stability in order to enjoy the comforts that come from that. Well, finally, I want to apply this in this way, that we need to be patient in progress. When he says, establish your work in the field before you build the house, I think for us, we would look at that and say, then that is time wasted. That why would you spend any time without the house? Just go ahead and build the house. Now, first of all, I think that's because if we buy a piece of land, like that's our thought process, right? We're usually not trying to turn that into an operational economic farm. But from the standpoint just of getting to the place that we want to end up, so many times people get into all sorts of trouble because they have left their parents' house and immediately they want to be back at the place where their parents are. They want to start there. They want to start in the same house, at the same economic level that their parents were at. And I do think, I'll have some more to say about that a little bit later, but there is a looking down on people who are willing to begin humbly and to work towards a greater degree of comfort. There is an impatience that goes along with that. And I think that impatience comes from a number of different places. In Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 10, it says, "If the axe is dull and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. Wisdom has the advantage of giving success." I don't know how many times I've been in a position where I've had to stop a job in order to do maintenance on a tool. Now, you could look at that as something that is frustrating, and it is in a degree. But when you're doing that, the mind often thinks, this is keeping me from my work. This is the work. This is part of the work. Like, you have to maintain the things that allow you to work. And so that's part of it. And the more you neglect that, in fact, the more time you're actually going to spend over there. Because it's not just sharpened axes now. Now it's engines and all sorts of other moving parts. And you better stop and give some attention to that, or you are going to end up giving a whole lot of attention to that, in fact. So we need to be careful that we don't have that mindset that says, this is keeping me from the thing that I really want to do. This is keeping me from what life is really about, as we think about enjoying the fruits of our labor. We develop an impatience to getting the result, and that leads to shortcuts that ultimately undermine the actual goal. I think in terms of the spiritual, this is the same. That we attend to the harvest before we attend to the planting and the watering. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 10, it says, according to the grace of God which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is built on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stone, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will indicate it, because it is revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. I am firmly convinced that what Paul is talking about here is not his own works from the standpoint of a life lived in service, but rather the material is the people. And there are people who go and make converts who will be burned up at the first moment of difficulty, the first moment of pressure. And in fact, I think that enough evidence can be supplied to show that there are people who make that their pattern of ministry, who go and report numbers, very high numbers. Look at all the people we've baptized. And I've actually heard people say, I've heard people report with a straight face, we baptized 25 people and 12 of those were for the first time. Because their model is to go out and get people to agree, but not to make disciples. It is a slow and difficult process to make disciples. It involves a lot of planting. It involves a lot of watering. It involves a lot of tending and cultivating that eventually leads to stability. And so this is true not just in our economic considerations, but in the ways that we think about how we build the church, how we build lasting things that are of spiritually lasting value. Along those lines, I think that we need to not only consider, that I want to enjoy these comforts, but I want to be building something that my children can enjoy. Or as Proverbs 13 and verse 22 says, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. I think one of the things that leads us to impatience is our sense of the brevity of life. One of the reasons people want to get to the comfort, get to the consumption, is they think I've only got so much time to live here and I don't want to spend it all working away without any enjoyment of the fruit of that labor. Well, let me just say in the first place, our truest reward was never here. James chapter 5 and verse 7 tells us, therefore be patient, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the soil, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. That's what we're working towards. But we also need to think, even in physical terms, I think, of generational building. This used to be a standard mindset, that I was preparing things that my children and my children's children would take up and enjoy and build on and continue to establish through the generations. It's why people would get into the worst sorts of conditions in boats to get across the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean to come to a place where they knew in their lifetime they were going to live in abject poverty. But there was hope at the other end of that generation that one or two or maybe even 3 generations later we'll get out of this. And there was no hope of that where they were coming from. And so you see that pattern over and over. And I think in the modern mind, I think especially in the modern Western mind, it's like, why would anybody go through something if they're not going to enjoy it? Because they thought generationally. And they loved their great-great-grandchildren in ways that I think we don't even think about. And I think God means for us to think that. I think that when God called Abraham to leave the land of his fathers, go forth, he says in Genesis chapter 12, from your kin and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And he even gives something of a time frame. You remember in chapter 15, he gives him some sense of scale, the hundreds of years that this is going to take. If somebody said to you today, I am going to make your family a blessing, a name that will be known and a blessing to everyone, but it's not going to happen for about 400 years, what would you think? I think a lot of people would say, so what? What has that got to do with me right now? And we should say that to our shame. That it ought to be something that we would cherish. That Abraham thinks that if I have this one son, then that will be enough to satisfy. That will be enough to give me the promise. I could just see the land. We don't have to own the land. If I could just see the land. Where's it going to happen? That would be enough in order to lift Abraham's heart. In Hebrews 11 and verse 8, it puts it this way. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he sojourned in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she regarded him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there were born even of one man, and him as good as dead, and that as many as the stars of the heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. I think that's true of tangible things. But I think it's even more true, of course, of intangible things, intangible projects, fields that we are meant to be cultivating. In Psalm 78 in verse 5, it says, for he establishes a testimony in Jacob and set a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and recount them to their children. I love that idea. That I could be teaching things, that I could be cultivating things in my home that children unborn will hear. That I could be teaching right now my great-great-grandchildren if I am paying attention to the field. If I am paying attention to the stable areas and not just sort of living off the wealth of my ancestors, which we do not only physically, but so often spiritually. I want to be engaged in setting things in place, preparing things that will sustain my children's children and not building just for the moment. Well, one more consideration along these lines, this idea of being patient in our progress, being willing to think generationally, and that is to think in terms of, am I improving the situation I was handed? In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, it says, "Then Yahweh God took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and to keep it." God set Adam into literal paradise and said, now work on that. Make that even better. Improve paradise. There's always room for improvement. There's always something we can be doing that makes things better. God expects improvement on what he has given us. I want to say, in terms of agriculture, in terms of what the Proverbs writer is thinking about as far as establishing work in the field, man has been seeking the shortcut for decades, seeking the shortcuts to receive the produce without putting the effort in. And they have destroyed in any number of ways the soil as they squeeze the last drops of life from it. They aren't thinking in terms of how do we leave this to our children better than we found it. It's how do we most cheaply and quickly get the thing that we want? Who cares what that means to the person who comes after me? And I think we can think that way, both physically and spiritually. But what about spiritual? Spiritual decay is too often the typical pattern. But I want to suggest to you that generational growth is possible. That it doesn't have to be that a faithful generation produces a less faithful generation. That doesn't have to be an automatic. But that there can be an effort made, there can be a vision and a carrying out of the vision that makes one generation stronger than the last. So how can we do that? How can we build on the foundations that have been laid? Godly parents produce children who take hard-fought spiritual battles for granted. And so they squander the maturity and wisdom that they started with. And maybe those godly parents fought those battles, and so they don't even recognize that they need to pass those things on. But not only that, they don't recognize that there's still work to do. There's growth on top of that. One of the things that I think as you look through history that you'll find as each generation talks about the next is that wise men recognize we fought our battles and now you're going to have to fight yours. And especially as one generation criticizes a previous generation, they'll say, well, they didn't talk about these things. And we're like, well, we were putting out these fires over here. So of course, we wish we could have talked about those things. But there was chaos, and we were trying to deal with it in the best way that we could. And the mature generation says, now, learn from that. Maybe we provided you a little bit of already tilled fields. Do something with that and build on it and grow. So we ought to be thankful for the faith of those who have come before us and learn to build more growth and maturity onto the foundation that they have already laid. If I started with an already cultivated field, did I continue to improve it, or did I waste all of that work? Did I just suck it dry and leave my children with a field to start all over with? Well, again, I think this needs to be applied. I think sometimes we look at a passage like this and say, well, the physical, yes, but the spiritual. I think they go hand in hand. I think that's one of the things about the Proverbs, is that when you are disordered in your view of how the physical world works, you're going to be disordered in your view about how the spiritual world works. Lack of self-control in one is going to correlate with lack of self-control in the other. They go hand in hand. I do think that we need to praise people who are willing to do the hard work and the humble work that starts in the field and then builds the house. I appreciate people who are willing to look at all the shiny cars and drive the one that's not shiny. Look at all the spacious houses and live in the one that's not spacious. Because they're thinking in terms of maybe one day we'll get there, but we don't want to get the cart before the horse. I appreciate that. And then I appreciate the people who are like that, who generally also are thinking in terms of not only how do we set these foundations financially, how do we set these foundations spiritually? That there's a lot of correlation very often with the person who's taking that humble approach and the person who's sitting down with their children each night and setting a family time of devotion and worship, laying those foundations that will cultivate a field that will be drawn from for their children's children. What about you? What needs your attention this week? Have you got a blank slate to start with? Have you planned in the way that God has advised using His wisdom? Where do you need to be creating more stability? Where do you need to go back to the field? Are you at work in a field at all? Let me just say, we're all tasked with work, and the Master is coming one day. And the question will be, are you sitting there trying to lazily enjoy the comforts, or are you out working? And the one who is lazily enjoying the comforts, the one who is lazily putting his talent under the ground, is going to be thrown into the lake which burns with fire. And the one who has taken what God has given him, has ordered his life in godly ways, is going to, like the 5-talent man, hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." If there's anyone who needs to respond to the invitation to become a servant of the Lord this evening, whether you have given your life to Him or whether you have yet to name the name of Jesus, if there's any way that we can help you make your life right with Him, won't you come forward this evening while we stand and while we sing?